Our top focus at this hour. Now, after months of simmering tensions at the Ukrainian border, things seem to be heading towards a tipping point. While on the surface, all players involved in this conflict, that is Russia, Ukraine, the United States and NATO, have been calling for calm. Their actions suggest otherwise. Now, the latest, US President held virtual crisis talks with European leaders on how to deter Russia from attacking Ukraine. He declared that there was total unity between the US and its Western allies. Listen in.
That's a great asset. I had a very, very, very good meeting, total unanimity with all the European leaders. We'll talk about it later. Thank you.
Now, across the Atlantic, the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg echoed a similar message that transatlantic unity was important in dealing with the crisis. But he also had this warning for Russia.
We are considering to further enhance our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. This could include the deployment of additional NATO battle groups. These deployments are proportionate and in line with our international commitments, and they reinforce European security for all of us. At the same time, NATO remains ready to continue dialogue with Russia. Let me be clear, NATO will not compromise on core principles. We stand for the right of each nation to choose its own alliances, and NATO's door remains open.
While NATO reiterated that it remains willing to continue dialogue with Russia, it's also not going to sit back and do nothing. Stoltenberg said it was ready to respond to any deterioration of security, including strengthening their collective defense. So far, NATO has about 4,000 troops in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia and Poland. They're backed by tanks, air defenses and intelligence and surveillance units. Now, backing NATO, the United States too put out around 8,500 troops on high alert over the situation, though they were not yet being deployed.
Secretary Austin has placed a range of units in the United States on a heightened preparedness to deploy, which increases our readiness to provide forces if NATO should activate the NRF or if other situations develop. All told, the number of forces that the Secretary has placed on heightened alert comes up to about 8,500 personnel.
Now, this comes after 4 rounds of talks between the United States, NATO countries and Russia produced no results. Now, as things stand, Russia maintains that it has no plans to invade Ukraine, alleges that Moscow is the target of mass Western hysteria. This despite having deployed some 100,000 troops on borders. Flanking it, Moscow has used its troop build-up to present the West certain security demands, including one where it wants NATO to pull back troops deployment from former communist countries in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, Washington has said that complying to such demands is out of the question. It is ready to discuss other ideas like arms control and missile deployments. Russia is still awaiting a written US and NATO response. Now, amidst all this, Ukraine meanwhile has called for calm, saying that it sees no signs of full-scale attack. This, as Britain said that it was withdrawing some staff and its dependents from its embassies in Ukraine. And the US said it was ordering diplomats' family members to leave the country. Meanwhile, the French government also announced that Russian officials would meet their Ukrainian counterparts along with French and German counterparts in Paris on Wednesday. This to try and find out a way to impasse. Now, as WION continues to bring you all the latest developments on this story, we'll end with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who summed up the situation, saying while intelligence is gloomy, he hoped that sense will prevail. And WION correspondent Kate Fisher sent us this report from Washington, D.C. Take a look.
Well, things in Washington really ramping up a gear when it comes to what's happening on Ukraine's border with Russia. Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin putting 8,500 US troops on high alert, telling them to be ready for a possible deployment to Eastern Europe as NATO and the US decide what they may or may not do in response to Russian aggression there. John Kirby, who is the spokesperson for the Department of Defence here, saying that no troops have yet been deployed, but the Secretary of Defence wanted to make sure that they had as much time as possible to prepare so that if they were called at short notice, they would be ready to go straight away. And he said this was all about reassuring the eastern flank of Europe that the US was there for them and that it was committed to the NATO alliance. This is a major pivot, really, for the Biden administration. Until now, they had tried to not provoke Russia into doing anything else. They kind of took a more restrained stance on all this. But clearly, they think that Russia is continuing to move troops to that border area. Talks with Russia haven't really got anywhere. And clearly, the Biden administration has decided that it is time to change strategy here. On Monday, the president held talks with his British, French and German counterparts. That was on a secure video link from the White House. They were discussing what more could be done to try to solve this crisis. And White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki saying that as far as the president was concerned, there was still the chance of Russia invading Ukraine at any time. There are, though, no scheduled meetings between the US and Russia in the coming week as yet, but there is some hope that perhaps diplomacy is not dead. We understand that Ukraine and Russia are due to meet in Paris. This is according to Emmanuel Macron, the French president, due to meet in the French capital on Wednesday for talks. So there is still some hope that this very worrying situation can be brought down a notch or two.